intellectual and political mainstreaming of Islamophobia, the role of elites, think tanks, and right-wing groups. We're delighted this morning to have with us three eminent scholars who will speak about the issue. And they will be introduced by our moderator. Our moderator this morning is Dr. Nuray Ocakli. She is a historian and the director of the History and Civilizations Graduate Program at Istanbul Zaim University. Dr. Ocakli completed her PhD in Economic History of the Ottoman Empire at Bilkent University in Ankara and continued her research at the University of Toronto and worked as a research associate there. Dr. Ocakli published articles on nomadic Turkmen migration to the Balkans, rural economy in Ottoman Bulgaria, and ethnic personal names in the Ottoman military registers. Currently, Dr. Ocakli is doing research on 18th century demographic surveys of Istanbul. Please welcome with me Dr. Ocakli. And I would like to approach to the podium Dr. Dalia Fahmy, Dr. Farid Hafez, and Dr. Usaama Al-Azmi.
Good morning, distinguished scholars and guests. Welcome to the second session of International Conference on Islamophobia. Thank you for attending this session. I'm Nuray, as the professor said. I'm a member of Department of History academic team at ISU. And it is my pleasure to be the moderator of this session. The title of this session is The Political and Intellectual Mainstreaming of Islamophobia, the roles of elites, think tanks, and right-wing groups. First of all, I would like to introduce briefly the speakers of this session. Our first session speaker is Farid Hafez. Farid Hafez received his PhD in political science from University of Vienna in 2009 and is currently senior researcher at University of Salzburg and a senior research fellow at Georgetown University, the Bridge Initiative. In 2017, he was Fulbright visiting professor at University of California, Berkeley, and in 2014 he was visiting scholar at Columbia University, New York. Since 2010, Dr. Hafez has been editor of the Islamophobia Studies Yearbook and since 2015 co-editor of the annual European Islamophobia Report. He has received the Bruno Kensinski Award for the Political Book of the Year for his anthology Islamophobia in Austria and published more than 80 books and articles including in high-ranking academic journals. Moreover, Dr. Hafez regularly published co-eds and is frequently interviewed by media outlets. And our second session speaker is Dalia Fahmy. Dalia Fahmy is Associate Professor of Political Science at Long Island University. He is a Senior Fellow at the Center for Global Policy in Washington, D.C., and a visiting scholar at the Center for Study of Genocide and Human Rights and UNESCO Chair of Rutgers University. Dr. Fahmy's three books, The Rise and Fall of the Muslim Brotherhood and the Future of Political Islam, and Liberal Intelligentsia and the Future of Egyptian Democracy. And the last one, International Relations in a Changing World, cover the research areas. Dr. Fahmy has published several articles in academic journals focusing on democratization and most recently on the effects of Islamophobia on U.S. foreign policy. She has given several DC briefings on the future of democracy in the Middle East. She has given several DC briefings in the future of democracy and freedom in this area. In 2014, Dr. Fahmy has one of the recipients of the prestigious Craigman Prize in Political Science. And our last session speaker is Usaama Al-Azmi. Dr. Azmi is a lecturer in Islamic Studies at the Markfield Institute for Top Higher Education in UK. His BA is in Arabic and Islamic Studies at Oxford University, and his MA and PhD in Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University. His dissertation explores Islamic political thought in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. In addition to academic writing, he is a frequent commentator on public affairs pertaining to Muslims in outlets such as Middle East Eye, HuffPost, Muslim Matters, and TRT World. He is currently working on a book that explores the political engagements and discourses of ulama who have opposed democracy and supported autocracy after the Arab Revolution. Before starting the presentations, I would like to remind you that the speakers shall have 20 minutes to deliver their speech, and questions will be asked after all speakers are done. Now, I would like to welcome our first session speaker, Farid Hafez. Dr. Hafez will deliver a presentation entitled Rationalizing Islamophobia, the Dangerous Role of Think Tanks.
Should I use the laptop or? No, I don't have nothing here. I'll tell you when to switch the slides. Well, very good morning, everybody. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you. And it's a pleasure being here. Thank you for the invitation and for organizing this conference again, Dr. Sami. What I'll do here is to present a case study, which I would argue goes beyond the two cases that I'm looking at, but I think they are very informative in the way think tanks are trying to produce a certain kind of knowledge and disseminate it in order to legitimize certain politics. In most of the literature that is known to us when we speak about think tanks and foundations is basically very US-centered. I think most of you know in these reports that I'm mentioning here, that's a few amongst many researches that have been produced within the last few years. And I think one of the interesting things is, what I want to do here is to connect this kind of knowledge with certain discourses that we are witnessing, have been witnessing, especially throughout the last few years. Linda Sarsour, or Rashida Tlaib, or Ilhan Omar are just amongst a few examples of very outspoken public voices with a Muslim background in the political field that have been attacked to allegedly be part, linked to whatever, in any way, to the Muslim Brotherhood. And it does not only, it's not only a debate that is going on in news media, but as we can see, and this is not the first attempt, when some GOP people tried to implement what has been referred to as the Muslim Brotherhood Terrorist Designation Act. The last attempt goes back to 2017, shortly after Trump was inaugurated. It failed, but at least we see that there are certain interests to ban the Muslim Brotherhood. This is also, again, not a US phenomenon, because if you look to 2015, there was this case in the United Kingdom when a report was drafted to estimate and to try to give an evaluation of who the Muslim Brotherhood was in Egypt, in the UK, in Europe. And what most of the observers are arguing is that all of this talk about the Muslim Brotherhood was actually not about the Muslim Brotherhood, but rather that it was very much about domestic Muslim institutions in these respective countries. Or in other words, it is about the most, to silence the most important political voices in the political field amongst people with a Muslim background, or people who are challenging the status quo and the system to a certain extent. So this is when we look at this whole idea of claiming somebody to be part of the Muslim Brotherhood, that it goes back to try an attempt to silence important political voices in the political field with a Muslim background in Europe or in the United States. For all those who read German, I have written a longer essay on this in a German language journal on the idea of where it comes from, this conspiracy idea of why the Muslim Brotherhood itself is so important in the idea of a world Muslim conspiracy theory. And most of what I'm going to present now today is also based on an article that was published at the end of last year called Muslim Civil Society Under Attack, the European Foundation for Democracy's Role in Defaming and Delegitimizing Muslim Civil Society. So it builds on these two works and goes a little bit beyond. When we are speaking about what some people refer to as the organized Islamophobic network, there are, again, most of the research that is done in the United States on one side, and on the other side in the UK. We have here one NGO to be mentioned at this point, Hope Not Hate, a UK-based organization that has done some research on what is it's what is called, and that's a name that they have given themselves, the counter-jihad movement. And the counter-jihad movement is kind of a network, a loosely affiliated network of different so-called human rights, so-called civil liberty organizations that basically try to use the idea of freedom of speech to counter Muslim voices in the public space. And one of the latest works that has been presented here in terms of going beyond the United States is a book presented by some British authors, Masumi, Mills, and Miller. And I'll also draw on this work a little bit because, again, this work has expanded the US horizon, but still it has not reached the European continent. Again, it is very much linked to the Anglo-Saxon world. So they have written about what they called elite social movements. And they identify elite social movements by two characteristics. One is that these movements have a privileged access to political decision making, and the other is that they have a lot of financial resources. So that's how they characterize these elite social movements. What I will do here is try to expand on this kind of research by going beyond the Anglo-Saxon world, because they again have spoken about the Henry Jackson Society and other well-known institutions. But I think a lot of what is going on in the rest of the world, in the Western Hemisphere, is very much neglected. So, first of all, my analysis here is of a Brussels-based think tank that operates throughout Europe, which is called the European Foundation for Democracy. And the second thing, what I want to do here is also to present a new trend that I think we can observe in the expansion of the notion of extremism. We all know about the CVE programs, prevent programs, all these programs that are focusing on Muslim people when it comes to countering violent extremism. And what I will show here is how this notion of countering extremism is much more widened by just widening the definition of the notion of extremism itself. So, very shortly about the European Foundation for Democracy. It ranks among the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy, which is Washington, D.C. based, ranks among the 10 most influential media and policy debates. It received a total sum of more than $2 million, nearly $3 million from 2001 to 2008, and is considered to be among the top 7 funders of the Islamophobia network. The European Foundation for Democracy is very much linked to the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy. And amongst the think tanks that are funded by the same persons that fund these neoconservative think tanks outside of the US, the European Foundation for Democracy in Brussels, the Henry Jackson Society, and NGO Monitor in Jerusalem and UN Watch in Geneva rank amongst the highest who get the money from the same funds. So who are the European Foundation for Democracy experts? This is just a few people that I've mentioned here, especially those who are very much engaged in trying to shape the public discourse on Islam in Europe. Again, in their respective nation states. So in Switzerland, for instance, Ilham Mania, in Italy, Valentina Colombo, in the United States, /Brussels, Lorenzo Vidino, in Germany, Ahmed Mansour, and in Sweden, Margus Nuray. All of these people, whatever you can read, you will read what they have published in all of these countries, you will basically find one idea there, which is an attack that this or that organization or individual is part of the Muslim Brotherhood. So although all of these Muslim actors in the political field are quite diverse, all of them are said to be part of the Muslim Brotherhood. And that was actually the beginning and the start of my research, because I was just wondering, like, how can they all have and focus on one and the same issue and topic, although they are speaking about so many different actors. So in the words of the director of the European Foundation for Democracy, which is also very settled and established in Brussels itself, does advocacy and policy recommendations for European supranational institutions, for the European Parliament, etc. Roberta Bonazzi, the director, once argued in a panel in the European Parliament, where she was saying, for too long we have seen the wrong organizations being empowered, being funded by national governments and European institutions. For too long we have seen that ideological groups have become the official representatives, ignoring the diversity within Islam. Some ideological organizations have taken over the whole debate. So the basic idea is that stakeholders on national and European levels are speaking to the wrong Muslims, but they should speak to different Muslims. Why? Because all of these Muslims are, in a way or the other, linked to the organized Islamist network of the Muslim Brotherhood. Or in the words of Lorenzo Vidino, about whom I will speak later again, what most European politicians fail to understand is that by meeting with radical organizations, they empower them and grant the Muslim Brotherhood legitimacy. There is an implied endorsement to any meeting, especially when the same politicians ignore moderate voices that do not have access to generous Saudi funding. This creates a self-perpetuating cycle of radicalization, because the greater the political legitimacy of the Muslim Brotherhood, the more opportunity it and its proxy groups will have to influence and radicalize various Muslim communities. So the main idea regarding the Muslim Brotherhood is that the Muslim Brotherhood is destroying social cohesion and is setting up what they call parallel societies or Muslim ghettos. So, in which way are they expanding the notion of extremism and radicalism? One of the experts of the European Foundation of Democracy once argued that Ahmed Mansour in Germany, that there are three groups of radicalization. On the top is Al-Qaeda and Daesh, followed by the Muslim Brotherhood, including Erdogan, and then by the Generation Allah, who might be prone to this radical version of Islam. The Generation Allah is basically all Muslim youngsters, and specifically Muslim male Muslim young men, right? So in this way, they are actually trying to draw a circle in which all of these organizations, and obviously for them, most of them established Muslim organizations in Europe are part of the Muslim Brotherhood network, are part of this circle of radicalization. So I think that shows very clearly in which direction they are heading. So what they are doing is they are expanding the notion of countering violent extremism by arguing that there is a notion of countering non-violent extremism, which means that it is not the extremism in act, the violence, but it is the extremism in thought, which means that they are targeting actually what people are thinking, right? It's targeting ideas of people. And that's what they want to criminalize, which is going much more further than we have seen in the past legislations that were built on the notion of CVE. So the two cases that I'm looking at is two reports that were produced in Sweden and in Austria in 2017. Both named the Muslim Brotherhood in Austria and Sweden. The Swedish report was published in 2017 by the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency, which is part of the Ministry of Defense, which is focusing on security and risk issues. The English translation was provided by the Clarion Project, which is, I think, very well known in circles like these, connected to Frank Gaffney, Daniel Pipes, most of the well-known Islamophobic figures. And written by whom? Magnus Norell, who is again what? An expert of the European Foundation for Democracy. All right, thank you. And the Austrian report was published a few months later by the University of Vienna, the Ministry of Interior Affairs, and the Office for the Protection of the Constitution, which is kind of the CIA of Austria, and the Austrian Integration Fund, which is part of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So again, very well funded, very well connected in the establishment. And again, who is the author? Lorenzo Guidino, who again is what? Senior Policy Advisor to the European Foundation for Democracy. What were the outcomes? They were very different. In the case of Sweden, to make it short, there was a backlash, because many scholars of religious studies and other people like Matthias Gardell, who is well known to some of you, they drafted a statement where they condemned and they criticized fundamentally the Swedish report, and it lost its legitimacy. So although it was used at the beginning to also withdraw funding from certain Muslim institutions, which even took place, but these Muslim organizations sued them and they won the cases and they got the money at the end. It was kind of a short interruption, but basically it was not really well received. For the Austrian case, it was quite different, because in Austria, other than in Sweden, where we still have liberals in power, since 1.5 years we have the right-wing government, the so-called Symbol Act was implemented, actually just a month and 1 week ago. But it was prepared like a few 1.5 years ago. And the Symbol Act outlawed the use of certain symbols, was based on a law that was implemented first time in 2014, banning the symbols of Daesh and Al-Qaeda, and this was now expanded to a number of other organizations. Most important, in my view, is also the Muslim Brotherhood. Why? Because if you read this report, you will see that basically everybody is Muslim brother, right? From the recognized Muslim church that is like part of the political system to different single voices, intellectuals, Muslim institutions. And I think by implementing a ban of the symbol, this is kind of the first step towards the banning of the institution that is claimed to be part of and spreading the ideas of the Muslim Brotherhood. So, this is where we are at in the case of Austria, rather in the case of Sweden, which is good. There was a big backlash to this report, and it was basically it has been ignored. And we will see what follows from that. And I think if we try to conclude the ideas, I think that is a very best practice example of how a think tank with creating certain kind of knowledge can have such a policy impact to reach a point where I think the first time in the Western Hemisphere we have actually the banning of the Muslim Brotherhood, right? And what we are seeing, especially in the framework of the European Union, especially in cases where you have long-time EU member states, when you have certain legislations that are restricting Muslim civil society or Muslim practice in general, we see that other countries, especially those from the eastern part of Europe, which have not been in the EU for so long, they are trying to basically replicate these legislations by arguing that if such a long-time member of the EU government, long-time member of the European Union is part and can do such a legislation, then we can also do the same. So, in a way, as we have seen already with the ban of the niqab and the ban of the hijab, these laws are replicated. So I think it is something we have to look at, because if that makes it becomes a normal, then we will see a completely different political landscape also in how world Muslim organizations, Muslim voices, critical voices with a Muslim background can operate in. So if you're interested in this, I have also a third study, banning symbols of extremism in Austria, targeting extremism or civil society, where you can find a bit more information about this legislation and what it means. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your discussion.
Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Hafez. Now, I would like to welcome our second session speaker, Dr. Dalia Fahmy. Dr. Dalia Fahmy will deliver a presentation entitled Islamophobia and U.S. Foreign Policy, the Rise of the Alt-Right and Mainstreaming of anti-Muslim sentiments.
Thank you. Can we load the... So first, let me thank everyone here and IZU and CIGA, and of course Dr. Sami for having me today. I have a PowerPoint. I can get started. It's in the computer? Oh. Can you just oh, that's yellow. Okay. So I just pressed. Okay. So again, so the title of my talk is The Rise of the Alt-Right and the Mainstreaming of Islamophobia. And what I want to talk about is a couple of things that we've seen in trend the past, not 4 years, but really draw a longer trend. And so A few months ago in Brooklyn, New York, where I teach, yeah, this color's really off. A few months ago in Brooklyn, New York, where I teach, a man was stabbed in the stomach in front of his wife and 5-year-old child, and was told, "I'm going to stab you because you're Arabic, and you deserve it." According to CNN, the Southern Poverty Law Center, the FBI, and more recently the ABC, in 2015 there were 63 incidents of attacks on mosques, the highest number ever, stating that 2015 has been the most intensely anti-Muslim period in American history. That attacks on mosques I could just keep talking. That attacks on mosques are often used as the measure of looking at Islamophobia in the United States. But it's not just mosques. We've seen an increase. Yeah. Thanks. So it's not just the desecration of mosques. We've seen Muslim community spaces, but really the physical attacks on Muslims and Muslim-looking people, because it's assumed that they're Muslim, that Muslim women, especially those that wear hijab, have become attacked more than ever. And it's not just about the outward symbols of Islam in the United States, mosques and hijab, it's really about the dehumanizing of those individuals. And so when we think about fear of Islam, that's become more and more prominent in everyday life political discourse, from nationwide anti-Islam rallies, controversy surrounding mosques all over the country, the illegal surveillance of MSAs in New Jersey, where I live, by the NYPD, attempts to pass anti-Sharia legislation in over 24 states, the famous arrest of a boy with a clock, the vitriol coming out of the Republican Party, questioning whether Muslims in office could be trusted. And it seems that the sentiment is on the rise. According to Gallup, 48% of Muslim Americans say they have experienced racial or religious discrimination in the past 3 years. And unfortunately, we've seen the end result of this, with the execution-style murders of 3 young people in North Carolina, the burning down of an Islamic school in Houston, and when 2 people in Michigan were asked, "Are you Muslim?" and they answered in the affirmative, they were actually stabbed to death. Not to mention the attacks on a few sheikhs in the Bronx a couple of months ago. Political campaigns included slogans that the United States is a Judeo-Christian country, indicating that Islam has no place here, that a Muslim president could not be trusted, that Muslims should not be included in cabinet positions, that mosques should be closed. Essentially, in 2015, there were several people running for president that believed America should exclude Muslims from the definition of what it means to be American. And in 2015, during President Obama's State of the Union address, when he says that the United States is a nation that will not tolerate anti-Semitism, the entire congressional body stood up and applauded. And in the next sentence, when he said that this is a country that will stand against rising anti-Muslim sentiment, not a single member of Congress stood up and applauded. And yet, we heard that silence loud and clear. And so when we think about what is Islamophobia, it's usually defined as the dislike and prejudice of Islam and Muslims. But what Islamophobia really is this fear and hatred and hostility towards Islam and Muslims perpetuated by a negative stereotype that actually has a political objective, which is the marginalization and exclusion of Muslims from social and political and civic life. So that it has an objective, it's not just the fear and hysteria. And that essentially is what Islamophobia is, or the definition that I'm working with. And how does this work? So for example, there's a really famous Fox talk show pundit who uses this statistic, that 40% of Muslims support terrorism, that 40% of Muslims support terrorism. And you keep hearing this. So if there's 1.8 billion Muslims in the world, then 720 million of them would have to support terrorism. If you look at the population of all of these countries, of Tunisia, and Morocco, and Libya, and Jordan, and Indonesia, and Malaysia, and Pakistan, and all the Muslims in India, that means every single one of those people in every single one of those countries would have to be supporting terrorism for that one statistic to be true. And we know it's not. And it's that falseness, that perpetuating of a narrative that creates this fear. When a conservative pundit by the name of Ben Shapiro, who's now the editor-at-large of a conservative website, Breitbart, which I'll talk about later, co-founds this media organization, a group called Truth Revolt, he says that 76% of Muslims are radical. 76% of all Muslims are radical. And where does this come from? He finds that in a Pew study done on Muslim-majority countries, when they ask citizens if they want religious courts or religious judges to decide on family and property disputes, and 76% say yes, he translates that number into 76% support Sharia, so 76% are radical, and so he says a country like Pakistan, where 76% want Sharia law, which is not what the question asks, that in a country of 179 million, that 135 million of them are radical. And it's these statistics that are founded on nothing, that have been studied and debunked, that say this is the perpetuation of the fear. This insinuation was actually really heard last Tuesday. So last Tuesday, there was a hearing in Congress on hate crimes and the rise of white nationalism. And one of the people that testified was Dr. Abu Salha. Dr. Abu Salha in 2015 lost 2 of his daughters in a shooting, an Islamophobic shooting, where it's the campaign of our 3 winners. He loses his 2 daughters. And throughout the hearing, he was repeatedly asked to explain and defend his Muslim faith, saying, "Are you not inherently violent?" He was first asked to do this by Maura Klein, the president of the Zionist Organization of America, who, believe it or not, is on the panel. Maura Klein, who has actually defended President Trump's claims that there were actually good people in the neo-Nazi rally in Charlottesville. After this, he's asked the first question by Representative Sheila Jackson Lee of Texas, who says, "Did you teach your children, your daughters, to hate?" And he says, "Absolutely not, Congresswoman. We definitely make sure that anybody who's racist or hateful is out." She then follows up by saying, "So the very fact of being Muslim, you're not filling your children or those in the mosque with hatefulness?" This is a man who lost 2 of his daughters. He says, "We fight this, actually." The next question that comes to him is, he's offered first condolences, but asked about the murder of the 3 Muslims, he says, "Well, doesn't Islam teach Muslims to hate Jewish people?" Again, he had to defend his faith. He says, "Actually, in the Quran, it says that killing any human being is akin to killing humanity." It took 3 hours before Dr. Abu Salha was actually asked a question about the topic of the hearing, which was the white nationalism. And so we're starting to see this really fomenting inside the political establishment. So what's going on? My paper tries to answer this question by saying that there's an inherent connection, that was what was once on the periphery, on the fringes, is now coming out of the core of the political establishment. And my paper aims to track the rising anti-Muslim sentiment in the run-up to an election as a strategy to foment fear for electoral success. Now, this is created by this formula that leads to the mainstreaming of anti-Muslim hate, creating this us versus them dichotomy, where you have interest groups, media outlets, and political figures working in tandem to actually create this hysteria around Islam and Muslims. And so what I want to look at is 3 moments. 2010 was a crescendo year of the nativist anti-Muslim trend, and its roots were really found in the 2008 election of President Obama. What was once localized rumors on the internet became now the narrative in how we understand President Obama. The national hysteria around the victory mosque, around Ground Zero, and the movement to ban Sharia legislation. So beyond electoral success, what we started to see was that episodes of American hysteria were tied to this tenor and climate of politics in the United States. It's becoming the most anti-Muslim bigotry is the publicly acceptable form of hate that allows people to bank on, candidates to bank on, to ultimately win electoral success. So I want to look at the 2008 presidential election, the 2010 midterm election, And then finally, the 2012 presidential election and what that teaches us for 2016. So in 2008, an interesting thing happens. You start to see the rise of the candidacy of Barack Obama. Now, this was interesting because he came to symbolize a fundamental change in the United States. This, not just his non-white skin color, but this new chapter in the societal evolution of the United States. The rumors around President Obama's religion led to this cumulative effect of several organized processes that began in the margins that ultimately became mainstream. The strategy was multi-pronged. First, the documentary film Obsession, Radical Islam's War Against the West, was distributed to more than 28 million voters in swing states. Rumors of Barack Obama's Islamic/Muslim faith was centered around a keynote address in the 2004 National Democratic Convention. But what we ultimately start to see is that the course was indicative of a deeper anti-Muslim sentiment, since the idea of a Muslim president seemed threatening to the United States' national identity. In January of 2007, Insight magazine, which is now defunct, an outlet owned by the same company that owns the right-wing Washington Times, published a story citing how associates of the Hillary Clinton campaign were able to unearth evidence that Obama, from the age of 6 to 10, attended a Wahhabi-oriented madrasa. This rumor, even though it was never substantiated, made it into Fox News. Glenn Beck's program kept perpetuating it. The New York Post, even before CNN, sent a journalist into Indonesia to investigate Obama and his madrasa. Eric Steckelbach, a personality of the right-wing evangelical network, who was once worked with the senior writers on an analyst in Steve Emerson's notoriously anti-Muslim investigative project on terrorism, wrote about how the United States was being Arabized and Islamized by Muslims leading up to this election. The 2010 midterm election is probably the most interesting for me because it points to a moment where anti-Muslim networks and interest groups really intersected in a critical thing. And it was first the hysteria around the Ground Zero Mosque, and then the national campaign to ban Sharia legislation. So, I'm sure we all remember the hysteria around the Ground Zero Mosque. Neither was it a mosque, nor was it at Ground Zero. There actually is a masjid close to Ground Zero. But the hysteria about this was really nothing to do with this project. It was the summer before the run-up to an election. And you start to see candidates pander to this anti-Muslim fear. And so you start to see protesters all over New York City protesting that we're erecting a victory mosque right on hallowed ground. And it became a term that would become a catchphrase. And so during this midterm election, Robert Spencer and David Harwitz contributed multiple articles a day on Jihad Watch and Front Page Magazine, actually focusing on exposing this radical Islamist agenda that was creeping into the United States. And they circulated a pamphlet called Obama and Islam, supposedly to detail Obama's plans to appease Islamic supremacy in countries like Iran, but more so like the United States. And so we started to see this question of anti-Sharia legislation, or the banning of Sharia law. Banning of Sharia law really had nothing to do with Sharia law. It was this proposal that the anti-Sharia movement, which bans the consideration of Sharia law in courts, was actually wanting to attract attention to Sharia in general, as a negative perception about what Sharia really is. And so some Republican members of the US Congress even endorsed a memorandum, Sharia, a threat to America, at the US Capitol. And it was Newt Gingrich's presidential campaign in 2012 where he described Sharia as a moral threat. Now, it was never about really getting the legislation passed. It was about creating this hysteria around Islam and Muslims in the run-up to the 2010 election that became very, very successful. And so why is it that you can weaponize Islamophobia for a political objective and that it works? I'm going to quickly jump over 2012 because I'm running out of time and I want to get to everyone's favorite, the 2016 presidential election. So in March of 2011, Trump begins a TV series appearance where he's talking about his suspicions of Obama's and non-American origins. And this lasts for about 6 weeks. And it starts to rally up the Republican base to the point where during this time period, 47% of Americans believe that their president is not American. And this became part of his rallying cry. It creates an atmosphere where at the time where the US was experiencing a resurgence of anti-Muslim paranoia, he starts to construe this US election by using the vehicle of right-wing and later alt-right conspiracies throughout his campaign. What was once the birther movement is now dropped and becomes the culmination of Republican fingers and influential right-wing social circles that are looking to actually redefine and raise the alt-right or the far-right and anti-Muslim conspiracies that had already been debunked and center them into the core political establishment. What was once fringe is now mainstream, and Republican circles were willing to actually participate in this. When President Trump actually wins in 2016, it did send a political shockwave. As someone who attended the Hillary Clinton victory party, it was a surprise that this moment was coming. But really, was it a surprise? When we start to see the far-right values, the conspiracies, the rise of the alt-right, we start to ask ourselves, how was this so easily exploited? How was it actually used on segments of the working class, the socio-political grievances that actually led to this electoral success moment? No problem. So, during his speech that Steve Bannon makes, he says that whether the West liked it or not, the fighting of the global war against Islamic jihadism and fascism, that Islamic State and Daesh might have been eating up territory, but the metastasizing is far quicker than governments can handle. And he's talking about metastasizing that's starting to touch the United States. And what he's facing is this expansion. What is today the global war on terror is not so much the global war on terror as it's the creeping of Islam into the United States. And his clear articulation of this becomes part of the policy. The socio-cultural effects of this are pretty interesting because what we start to see is the explosion of violence. In the first month after his election, there were 1,094 acts of violence that were quoted by the Southern Poverty Law Center. And you start to see a great uptick in this. This led to policies from the Muslim ban, which we are all aware of, but it was Steve Bannon, as the chief White House counsel at the time, that played a pivotal role in Trump's initial executive order. And banning people from Muslim-majority countries was part of this, and he says, we don't want them here. And so President Trump picks up the language of the we don't want them here. And you start to see these statements of having dog whistle characteristics, very successful in that regard. The executive order stated that the religion of the individual is a minority religion in the individual's country and of nationality that he or she would be admitted. Basically, anyone coming from a Muslim majority country couldn't. The Muslim ban seemed at its best an effort to fulfill this promise, keeping with that essentialist view. Ultimately, what we saw was a symbolic rise between Trump, the Trump campaign, the presidency, and the alt-right and the culture, helping bring the far-right attitudes and ideas that had long been relegated to the margins of society back into the social political limelight. We also start to see the weaponization of free speech, where what was, I know others will talk about it because it happened at Berkeley, we start to see, along with other dog whistles, immigration and crime, and although these remain thin, we start to see public lectures by far-right pundits, like Milo Yiannopoulos and Ann Coulter, appearances that were pulled but still picked up the discourse of there's this violent clash on free speech happening. And the ruse of the public and the private, where it was said in public that this is not actually a war on Islam, but all private documents actually go counter to that, make us wonder what is really happening within the political establishment and why is it so effective. Now, those in power start to reflect this more so. So, Bannon and Yiannopoulos were not just the first in the Trump administration or those who were close to the Trump administration who accompanied him at the start. We saw his national security advisor, Michael Flynn, call Islam a vicious cancer. And he's part of the board of Act for America. We start to see Stephen Miller, who still serves as senior advisor to the president, who along with Bannon was a co-architect of the Muslim ban and other things. David Horowitz co-organized the Islamofascism Awareness Week at university campuses all over America. Sebastian Gorka, who for a while was Trump's deputy assistant, has links to far-right European and once and violent fundamental aspects of Islam. And so these might be just a few examples, but they're really reflective of this growing trend of what used to be in the margins becoming mainstream. And so ultimately what we see is that that symbiotic relationship between those three elements, while they're not perfect, are really coming to the forefront today. And the question becomes, why is it that Islamophobia continues to be weaponized and used successfully? Why does it work? And what makes Islamophobia continue to be a publicly acceptable form of racism and bigotry? 2 days ago, the New York Post owned by Rupert Murdoch, published a cover of the Twin Towers and Ilhan Omar, right? Saying, we will never forget. Last night or yesterday morning in the United States, President Trump also tweets a picture of Ilhan Omar saying, we will never forget. And here's another example of the intersection of those three things. Last week, we started to hear that President Sisi's call, visit to the United States, actually part of it was a request for the continued designation of the Muslim Brotherhood. That this is all part of the same narrative coming out of this political establishment. Now, although that's my conclusion, I just want to say one thing about terminology. I use the term alt-right, but I'm starting to question my use of that term. And the reason is that in 2010, the American white nationalist Richard Spencer launched the Alternative Right web magazine as a way to kind of clean up the language of white nationalism. So he coins the idea of the alt-right, and we pick it up and start using it. The alt-right is a white nationalist movement. It's a racist movement. Part of its members support anti-immigration policies, and they want to continue this in the United States. Others call for the breakup of the country to form a white separatist ethno-state. But even while white nationalism, even that's wrong. Because what I think the correct term that we should be using now is white power. The white power is really about the lead up to the race war. That activism within white power is really about white nationalism, not in the context of the nation state, but in the context of the Aryan nation. That we want to start thinking about, are we using the right terms when we discuss this? Is it simply about immigration policy or identity, or is it about the elimination of the other and the language of the elimination of the other? If we start to use the right terms, we might begin to ask ourselves possibly the right questions. What are the goals of the white power movement? The policies are not simply about immigration, but the policies are about the fostering the idea of the elimination of the other, because the preservation of the self can't happen until all the others are gone. And so one of the things I'm starting to think about, especially since New Zealand, is have we been using the right terms? We've been using the alt-right, and that was given to us. And then we changed it a few months ago into, well, wait, maybe it's white nationalism, but that's simply immigration. White power is part of an international global agenda of a creation of a pure race. And that wants a race war. And so we have to ask ourselves, is that where we're going? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fahmy, for your presentation. Now I would like to welcome our third session speaker, Usaama Al-Azmi. Dr. Azmi will deliver a presentation entitled Using Islamophobia as a Tool in Supporting Autocratic Rule.
Sorry, I just need to get my turn. Sorry, someone else controlling this computer. Firstly, thank you to Istanbul University, Professor Sami Harian, for kindly inviting me. It's really been a fantastic sort of experience so far, and I think there's excellent work being done here under your leadership and under the leadership of the institution. So I just wanted to thank you for that. So I'm talking about using Islamophobia as a tool in support of autocratic rule. On the way here, I sat next to a Chinese colleague, and I realized the biggest autocracy on the planet is China. Unfortunately, I'm not going to talk about the Uyghurs, who are one of the most sort of persecuted minorities in the world at the moment. But what I am going to talk about is the Arab world. So you have the figures, these people over here. I've got a lot of slides. I'm going to sort of rush through it relatively quickly. I hope this works. No, it doesn't. Okay, that's all right. Okay, so I've been sort of, so in the last, this is from about a week and a half ago. Well, I mean, since this is up, I don't technically have anything to say. This is from Hassan and a colleague, Ola Salim, sorry. Oh, sorry, what's going on here? Technical difficulties. Okay, so I'm going to. And so what you have here is a situation where there's an increasing recognition of the role that Arab states specifically play in promoting Islamophobia. To what end? That's also a question that I'll be looking at briefly. But anyone who hasn't read this article, it's more or less a summary of my talk at this point. So I would recommend having a look at it. And this is quite a well-established trend. So I've just given brief highlights, but it goes back at least to the Arab Spring in 2011, and even further back, of course, the post-9/11 context. I'm very tempted to see if I'm not going to use this computer at all, so I'm not going to show you any videos, because I don't want to screw up the slides. But some of you may recognize this. This was a short talk, a clip of which showed up on YouTube, I think a year after it happened. This was given in Saudi Arabia sometime around May 2017, I think. And that chap over there is the UAE Foreign Minister, Abdullah bin Zayed. And he basically is warning Western governments of the threat that Muslim populations in their midst pose to them. And saying that, he says it in Arabic first, and it's bad enough. And then he says, okay, let me take the time to say this in English. Just so, in case the translators don't get it exactly right, I want to give this message out there. Because you're trying to be politically correct, you're ignoring the the terrorists in your midst, and essentially saying, clamp down on the Muslims in your communities, in your countries. This is something that we in the West complain about our right wing doing, but it's happening obviously, on the part of the Middle Eastern rulers, and the UAE unfortunately takes the sort of lead role in this. But this goes back earlier. So in 2014, he gave a Fox News interview, and it's still on their website, where he says basically that this is in the context that CARE, Islamic Relief, a few institutions in the UK, other institutions in the US have been designated terrorist organizations by the UAE. They sort of published this list. And immediately in the UK, for example, we have a situation that a number of civil society institutions get letters from banks saying, we're closing your accounts, you are now sort of like a security concern or something along those lines. So this has repercussions for Muslims in Western countries. But when he's asked by Fox News, and the Fox News anchor is saying, this raises some eyebrows in the US, what's going on here, can you explain yourself? This is Fox News saying that it's raising eyebrows, right? And he says, well, our bar for what constitutes terrorism is very low. And so even the slightest bit of terrorism is enough for us. The suggestion that civil society activism is terrorism is basically any kind of Muslim public activism that talks about Muslim rights, the rights of citizens, democratic rights on the part of institutions like CARE, and also any kind of critique of Israel, if we think about it in those terms, also falls under terrorism for these people. Okay, there's a remarkably Orwellian discourse, and as I say, the UAE takes the sort of biscuit on this. It really takes the lead. So this is the newfound Minister of Tolerance in the United Arab Emirates. He was one of the people who was hosting the Pope, and obviously part of the family of rulers in the UAE. In 2017, he made remarks to a German news agency saying, countries like Germany, France, Britain and Belgium were not exerting enough controls over their local mosques that were necessary to prevent terrorism. So again, you have this entire discourse that generalizes the sort of securitization discourse towards the entire Muslim population. So, prevent CBE, these sorts of things may be considered Western ideas that have been developed for white privilege to control sort of minority populations, brown and black bodies. But it's something which has been co-opted wholesale by these people. And perhaps I'll reflect a little on why that might be towards the end of this presentation. Okay, so the creating of a Zionist-friendly Islam. This is, one component of this. It's part of a broader project. But you have prominent scholars, and these are three very prominent scholars. Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, Imam Majid, Muhammad are prominent US figures, who have a great deal of respect in the community. And Abdullah bin Bayya is a Saudi-based Mauritanian scholar, who I'll talk about a little more. And they're sitting here with a delegation that has been tweeted by Jonathan Greenblatt, who is one of the leaders of the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League. I remember Norman Finkelstein, the first time I'd heard of the Anti-Defamation League, he said, oh, the Anti-Defamation League, they defame people. And I think that's very accurate. They basically have a long history of, actually defamation, for want of a better term. It's in their name, I suppose. But they also have a very long history of attacking Muslim civil society organizations, perhaps not as long as their long history of defamation generally. And so CARE is one of those targets, again, one of the most important Islamic civil society organizations in the United States. But this is happening in the UAE, this meeting, and they are kind of being welcomed into the mainstream of public discourses in the Middle East and Islamic discourses that are global. This was part of a conference, this took place in December as part of a conference known as Forum for Promoting Peace in Muslim Societies. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. Now, there's, of course, a geopolitical context to this, and I want to take it back to the proximate cause of the current growth of the Islamophobia industry within the Arab world. The proximate growth is basically the Arab Spring, which has created an existential crisis for Arab monarchies and Arab autocrats. You have, in 2011, obviously everyone is aware of the history that brought about popular revolts against autocratic regimes throughout the Middle East, and it's still, in many respects, in process. It's had setbacks. But in 2011, this takes place. This is one of the most important scholars in Egypt at the time. He's still very significant. He still has, a few million followers on Facebook, and I'm not sure if he shows up on TV quite as much, but he still is a very prominent figure. His name's Ali Jumara. And he basically this is from the 23rd of August 2013, this screenshot, 10 days after the Rabaa massacre. And the Rabaa massacre, as many of you will know, hopefully all of you, is kind of a historic moment in the history of Islamic movements in recent decades, where over 1,000 people, according to Human Rights Watch, 1,000 peaceful protesters in Egypt protesting the coup that sort of unseated the first democratically elected president in Egyptian history. They were massacred by the army and the security forces. And one of the people who was championing the justification on religious grounds was this person, the former Mufti of Egypt, Ali Jumara. But what I want to focus here on is, even though there's a very distasteful justification that lasts, as if you can see the sort of time here, almost 2 hours, and this is just one of the justification sort of interviews he gives. You can see this at the bottom. Egypt under attack. Misr tuharib al-irhab. The discourse is really interesting. Egypt is confronting terrorism, it says in Arabic. Egypt under attack. This is the same discourse of securitization against Muslim populations. In this instance, it's saying that anyone who is going against the current coup regime that has just killed over 1,000 people in broad daylight in front of the international media is a terrorist. Right? The terrorists are the people who are being massacred en masse. But in the same year that happened, so this happens in August 2013, the UAE has been in conversation with Abdullah bin Bayya in Saudi Arabia from early that year. And there's a tweet which I've not posted here of Abdullah bin Zayed around April or March 2013 posting his visit to Abdullah bin Bayya's home in Saudi Arabia early that year. And this is the building of a relationship that is illustrated on Abdullah bin Bayya's own website actually. If you go into the news archives, you can see that there are multiple meetings taking place in the lead up to and indeed after the coup in Egypt between the UAE and Abdullah bin Bayya. And so by, let me come back to Abdullah bin Bayya in a moment, my slides are a bit. Around the same time you have this sort of discourse coming out of Egypt. This is in 2015, and this is a book, Al-Mubin, I'll translate that in a moment, by this chap, Usaama Al-Azmi, here sitting with Sisi. And his official title is Al-Mustashar li-Maktab al-Rais. He's Al-Mustashar al-Dini li-Maktab al-Rais. He's the religious sort of consultant for the office of the presidency. This is a book whose title is, I've put Orwellian Islamic scholarship, Al-Haqq al-Mubin, the manifest truth, fi raddi ala man tala'aba bid-din, in refuting those who play with the religion, okay, who sort of use the religion in a way that takes advantage of it. And it's a refutation basically of the Ikhwan. The subtitle says, تيارات التطرف من الإخوان إلى داعش في ميزان الهدم. So it's creating this equivalence between groups like Muslim Brothers and ISIS, saying that it's a refutation of trends of extremism from the Ikhwan to ISIS. And so this becomes the official discourse. It's a 200-plus page book, and its argument is that the Ikhwan are represented by Sayyid Qutb, and Sayyid Qutb was an extremist who basically did the takfir of all Muslims, and this is the ideology of the present-day Ikhwan, who consider everyone a kafir, and therefore they are Khawarij. They are basically people who are theologically heretical. Okay. Now, bin Bayya is another sort of, as I mentioned, a very important figure here. And he has a very interesting personal history. I have 7 minutes according to my clock, so I'm doing all right. Abdullah bin Bayya is here being kissed by Mohammed bin Zayed, the de facto ruler of the counter-revolutionary sort of UAE. And the UAE takes the charge, it is the leading sort of force in counter-revolutionary Islam in the region. And so he is, in 2013, after the Rabaa massacre, about 3 weeks afterwards, he resigns his position from the International Union of Muslim Scholars, which is this institution over here. The International Union of Muslim Scholars is an interesting institution because by this point, it has a reputation under the leadership of Yusuf al-Qaradawi of being extremely pro-Muslim Brothers in Egypt. And even though it's officially a non-partisan organization, its sympathy for the Muslim Brothers, if anyone has the slightest sympathy for them, they are automatically labeled as Muslim Brothers. And so, Abdullah bin Bayya at this moment, when this polarization has taken place, he resigns 3 weeks after the Rabaa massacre, September 9th, 2013, from the International Union of Muslim Scholars. And he sets up this organization. This has its inaugural meeting in, if I recall correctly, March 2014. But what's interesting to me is the website for this organization is registered in November 2013. So it's already in the works. It's being planned quite it's well organized from straight after the Rabaa massacres. You have August, the Rabaa massacre, September, the resignation from the International Union of Muslim Scholars, and then November, just a couple of months later, this organization is established as a website, and it has its inaugural meeting in March. And I've argued elsewhere in a paper which I hope will be published later this year, that this is basically Forum for Promoting Peace in Muslim Societies is the UAE's answer to the International Union of Muslim Scholars. This is how it was perceived when it sort of came out. And what's interesting about the institution is it very self-consciously promotes this close, intimate relationship with political authority. So if you go on it, there's a page which is called the sponsor page or the patron page, and that has prominently figured. I mean, the only person on that is the foreign minister of the UAE, Abdullah bin Zayed. They don't even pretend to be independent because, you know, the International Union of Muslim Scholars says it's independent. They literally sort of show themselves to be a functionary of the UAE Foreign Ministry. Because in their view, that's how it should be. Religious scholars should be genuflecting to the power of the state. Okay. And so I want to look at one case study. That in 2017, the Forum for Promoting Peace in Muslim Societies issued a statement condemning Qatar within 24 hours of the boycott of Qatar being announced by the sort of 4 countries that were boycotting Qatar, led by the UAE and Saudi Arabia. And immediately you have a number of attack pieces being published by Al-Azmi is, of course, a Saudi-owned UAE-based outlet, which was developed as a counter to Al Jazeera. Okay. One thing to mention before I go into this particular issue is that the Forum for Promoting Peace, issued a very strongly worded statement condemning Qatar for promoting terrorism. Okay. And then so this is what these scholars are engaged in the name of Islam, attacking sort of another Muslim country. And Qatar had an interesting foreign policy orientation that was trying to say, we want to see greater freedom of speech and greater sort of political accountability in the Arab region. So what do? Al-Azmi publishes a hit piece on Yusuf al-Qaradawi. Tamim bin Hamad is the sort of Emir of Qatar kissing the forehead of Yusuf al-Qaradawi. This was a photo which cam out around the same time. Qatar basically kind of couldn't really give a damn about the boycott, and so they published this around that time. Qaradawi, top advocate of suicide bombings. Now, Qaradawi himself actually had said in an interview about 6 months earlier that I don't think that photo is appropriate in that context. Okay, he said this in an interview on Qanat al-Hiwar, which you can watch on the internet. So he's actually retracted. But who actually still believes in suicide bombings? You have Ahmed al-Tayyib, who never recanted from his strong defense of suicide bombings in 2002 when he was visited by the Charge d'Affaires of the United States. In his office, he was then the Mufti of Egypt, and the US Charge d'Affaires was insisting that you have to condemn suicide bombings. This is in the context of obviously Palestine, but also in the context of the post-9/11 discourse. And what's really interesting, he says, I'm not going to change the religion and condemn the only weapon that the Palestinians have. Right? This is a person, incidentally, who is also supported by the UAE. One of the organizations that has been instituted, the Forum for Promoting Peace and Muslim Council of Elders is also established by the UAE in 2014, and it still is running, and that's headed by Ahmed al-Tayyib, right? And of course, you have someone like Ali Jumu'ah. I just include him because, he's not very intimately included in the UAE's web, but he's part of the global Islamophobic discourse. I wanted to include his quote because I find it so just wacky, shall we say. Do martyrdom operations constitute suicide? No, they're not suicide. They're martyrdom in the path of God. Whoever calls it suicide, let us call him a donkey. Rather than excommunicate him and take him out of the Muslim community, we'll call him a donkey in the hope that he turns back. But if he insists, we'll excommunicate him. This is on YouTube, you can read it, and that's said in funny Egyptian style. Okay, so the reason I'm mentioning this is that the vilification of Qaradawi is obviously part of a narrative that fits into the terrorist discourse of Prevent. This is someone who promotes suicide bombings. Suicide bombings is often also associated with Palestine specifically, and all of these scholars who support it are talking about the Palestinian context. But, this is an emotive issue for Western publics and Western policymakers, so it's an easy target to try and sell this. And the audience is very much the Western audience, Western policy audience. I'll just take 1 minute if that's all right. So why are Muslim countries being Islamophobic? Right? I mean, what sense do we make of it? And to this, I can refer to Muhammad Fadl has a very nice article on the way in which Ilhan Omar, Rashid al-Tlaib, and Linda Sarsour were attacked after sort of their election, the election of the first two, to the House of Representatives. And this was an attack that took place on Al-Azmi. Again, it's a very long-form article. These people are ultimately concerned about their own existence. These autocracies have an existential angst that has emerged after the Arab revolutions, and it's been made very real. And so, in many respects, the Islamophobia is somewhat insincere. It's really about, it's not that they have a problem with Islam, they're technically Muslim themselves. They are really interested in using whatever tools are available to perpetuate themselves and attack any kind of accountability, any kind of democratic movements, any kind of freedom of speech in their areas. And Islamophobia is a gift of a tool in the post-9/11 context for doing just that. And it's something that we really need to think about how to invert that discourse. Dr. Shakulev, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Al-Azmi. And thank you very much for all the presenters for their interesting talks. Thank you. Well, dear distinguished scholars and guests, now we come to the questions, comments, and answers session. Dear guests, please mention your name and state to which presenter you address your question. The speakers will going to take all the questions and comments, and then each speaker going to answer the questions. Any questions and comments, please? Can we switch the microphone, please? Okay.
Hi, I am Sumaya. I'm first year student, International Treatment and Finance. Actually, I am from Egypt. So I have one question, it's very simple, in my mind all the time during the events that happen in Egypt. What are strategies that, for example, like Ali Juma used for affect on people's minds that just like when you see like someone from Ikhwan Muslimin that is terrorist, even like we see everything in our streets. Even I was in Rabat, I couldn't believe the media. I couldn't believe just I have to go to the street and then see what's happening there. They are just saying like such like silly things that against Islam. And then there is no such a rule that should like prevent those people like Ali Juma, Ahmed Tayyib to be considered as like Islamic or religious man. So he said like that, we all the time we have to prevent or have to attack terrorists, but look at his speech. Like for example, we called us like in Rabat, we are like Khawarij, like just like okay, you shouldn't like say no for the government. You should respect your president. You should. So, what about your speech? How like use these such Islamic rule to their interest? I didn't see. I also shocked like Egyptian. They are still believe in Sisi and they are still believe in Ahmed Tayyib, in Ali Juma. So, what are the strategies and what are the benefits that he got from? And thank you so much.
Thank you for your question. Next question, please.
Hello, my name is Marsiha. I come from Macedonia, from the Balkan. So I have like a question to Professor Farid. You mentioned CVA, which is or PVI, which is very famous in now. Should the Muslim use this narrative so that we can bind or prevent the white supremacist, white superpower? Should we use the same narrative, or should we be included in this process that are happening in the Europe now? And I couldn't understand from the Professor Usaama, so why are the precise figure, like Congresswoman Ilhan Omar was attacked by Saudis and the other, but also why is so Islamophobia happening around her as an individual, because it's not first Muslim Congress person in the Congress, so why she's being attacked so much? Thank you.
Thank you. Any question? Yes, please.
Have a good day, and thank you all for your presentations. I'm Filiz, I'm from Turkey, and I'm a doctorate student at Boğaziçi University, International Relations. My question is to Professor Dalia and Usaama, Dr. Usaama. I have a friend of Palestinian origin living in New Jersey, same as you. When she came to visit us, she examined the mosques, the interpretations of Islam, and she criticized it so harshly that it's not pure Islam, that it's a Sufi interpretation of the Islam and stuff. And even we are friends, and I realized that even in the Muslim community, we can't tolerate the differences and different interpretations and differences mainly. So I don't know how to overcome that. We can't concentrate on the idea of solidarity as it's mentioned yesterday. So I'd like to hear some strategies and advice on that context.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Zinat. I'm an international relations analyst from South Africa. My question and comment is to Dr. Farid and to Dr. Usaama. For both of you, you spoke about the Muslim Brotherhood, and Dr. Usaama, you referred to the siege of Qatar. I did a paper on that at the time, and I also found the similarities, and the link that I drew was on the Terrorist Designation Act and the Palestinian International Terrorism Support Prevention Act, both of which were put forward to Congress in the United States, very much at the time of the siege of Qatar. And it seemed to be a movement to try and sanction Qatar financially from having support towards the Muslim Brotherhood, towards Hamas and other organizations as such. Since then, the UAE in particular has been very vocal in trying to condemn Qatar as being a terrorist supporting state. And recently they've drawn in Turkey and Iran into an axis of perhaps drawing from the American notion of an axis of evil in the region. How do you see this playing out going forward with the American influence over that and with these congressional acts that have been tabled? And do you see these alliances between Turkey and Qatar, and perhaps Iran to a lesser extent, becoming something more than just a Cold War within the Gulf region? Thank you.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Usaama, for your informative presentation. I was not present for the earlier speakers, so unfortunately I cannot place any questions. So when you were discussing the scholars who were addressing these issues regarding designating some people as terrorists and others as not, so do you think this is part of a sincere effort? Like, do they sincerely believe that they are terrorists, or are they just like scholars for hire? How is it? Do we understand that?
Thank you for your question. There is a lady, please. Thank you. It's not working.
Thank the panelists for the stimulating conversation. I'm Fadil Chalabi. I'm a second-year student here at ISU. I study political science and international relations. I have two questions. First is sort of very general. It relates to all of your three presentations. So you explained to us that there is this sort of imposed narrative that comes from literature, that comes from statements of political figures and Congress people, from governments in Europe and the US. So how can we challenge this authority that comes from the people that provide these statements and this narrative? Even if maybe our statements or defense is reasonable or rational, how can we still sort of challenge the authority of the media and those people? And my second question is for Dr. Usaama Al-Azmi. I'm very curious about the case study that you chose at the end. When you sort of compared these statements of suicide bombings between Ali Jum'a and Al-Qaradawi, so especially when they were provided in this context of the Palestinian resistance. So should we instead call Ali Jum'a and all these scholars supported by the UAE, should we call them terrorists or what? Like, what isn't that they are sellouts and sort of supported by these Islamophobic or this prejudiced governments of the UAE and Saudi Arabia? Shouldn't that be enough, or should we use the sort of language that maybe other Islamophobes use against us? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Next question, please. Hello.
My name is Caroline Nord. I'm obviously not from Turkey. I'm from Canada. Since 9/11, we have seen the rise of Islamophobia and anti-Muslim sentiments. We have seen far-right people regrouping, making association in groups. We have seen Islamophobia used as a political weapon for self-interest. But my question, it has been going on for years now, and we're able to make a list, too long list, of unforgivable events and situations. So my question is, where is the counter discourse? I would like to see Muslim leaders to stand up and be able to rally people, other leaders, non-Muslim leaders, and talk about tolerance and everything. But it's not happening. Media is a very strong tool in this current situation. And as an average person, I don't see any counter talk, counter speech. So I would like to know, where is it? Is there something that stops it? Why is it not happening? Thank you.
Thank you. Please, Jen.
Thank you very much, panel. That was a wonderful presentation by everyone. Dr. Hafez, criminalizing thought is very frightening. We are used to physical Islamophobic attacks. But going into abstract level of criminalizing thought is indeed frightening. Can you enlighten us further on that, please? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Next question, please.
My name is Yasser, head of Department Fiqh and Usul in the University at Malaysia. My question is, you mentioned the report 40% of Muslims support terrorism. So you said Indonesia more than 200 million, Malaysia 31 million, total more than 700 million Muslims. So my question is, what do you mean about in Malaysia 31 million about this, and where another countries, and when this report about this? Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you for your question. There's a gentleman too. Oh, sorry.
I am Manzir Kaf. My request to Dr. Hafez is to give us more information about the failure of the report in Sweden. That could be a good example of taking action against similar Islamophobic procedures. So please give us more details and what has been done in court and outside court. Thank you.
Thank you, Parker. There's another question.
Good morning. Congratulations for the three lectures. Very, very good. My name is Bruno Mendelski. I'm a PhD student at the Brazil University in Brazil and also doing my PhD in Istanbul University. I have a theoretical question. If it's possible, understand the concept of Islamophobia as a violation of the fundamental freedoms of the Muslims, or as a violation of the human rights of the Muslims, or these both concepts, human rights and fundamental freedoms, are Western concepts and complicates the understanding of the Islamophobia. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Next question. There was a gentleman, please.
Assalamualaikum, thank you very much. Just two questions, one for Professor Farid and one for Professor Dalia. For Professor Farid, the presentation was actually quite fascinating because the Muslim Brotherhood, the Ikhwan, is something that you're absolutely right. Particularly within, I'm less familiar with Europe, but within the United States, it's an obsession from the Obama administration that somehow the Ikhwan has infiltrated all of the levels of government and so on and so forth. Hillary Clinton's assistant is some Muslim woman, and all of this rhetoric has been internalized within the United States. At the same time, and this is where I just adding a friendly amendment, that internationally it's being declared a terrorist organization. So a group like, say, for example, CARE, before we had criticisms that it's Gulf funded and so on, that it's very apolitical on certain issues. Now all of a sudden, overnight, because of the Egyptian process, the declaration of Ikhwan as this terrorist group by the Saudis and the UAE, all of a sudden all these organizations, Ikhwan, Muslim Brotherhood, it's a pariah statement for every single one of these organizations, mosques, and so on. So I think that it is both a domestic thing, an internal thing, but it's very much linked to this global politics of Islamophobia, and the Ikhwan sits at the center of it. Whatever one may think about the specific platform politics of the Muslim Brotherhood, it has become the catchword at the center of this global Islamophobia campaign, linking the domestic to the international. So that's the first point, and I think you're absolutely right. Today we see the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy. Now, I wasn't aware that also Europe has its own this similar thing foundation, but the United States clearly does. And in some ways, it has taken upon the role of what the CIA would do in the past. The Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, the Atlantic Council, all of these organizations are now complicit in all of these regime change, subversive activities, so on and so forth. And I think you hit the nail on the head, because often our focus is on government, CIA, all of this, whereas these organizations are actually the ones that are very actively so-called intervening in other people's elections, political process, and so on. So sorry, that was more of a comment. For Professor Dalia, very quickly, the comment on Pakistan was interesting, where you cited 76% of Pakistanis desire Sharia. Now, that may be true, but two things. One is that, of course, the mainstream Islamist political parties, whatever respect they have never done electorally well in Pakistan. And I hate to quote him because he's certainly not one of the more knowledgeable Orientalist scholars, but Noah Feldman is correct when he says that when these demands for Sharia throughout the Muslim world are made, It's about justice. That it's not about some ordinary Muslims looking at the intricacies of fiqh and so on. It's about justice, and that's why I would argue, as a partisan, that Imran Khan is in power now in Pakistan, because the Pakistanis did want an alternative, and his group's name is the Movement for Justice. And the final thing that I'll say is the Obama and the religion thing. That Obama, it's always a double-edged sword, and it's the same with anti-Semitism that worked before, right? So on the one hand, the Jews are this underclass of subversives, socialists, and so on, but on the other hand, they also control the world through a cabal. And with the Muslims, it was kind of the same thing, you know? They're underclass Muslims in Europe and so on, but the most powerful person in the world, Barack Obama, is a Muslim controlling the world. And I would argue that all the way till the end, when he was stepping out of office, till 2016 in the United States, I mean, for 8 years, my daughter and I would go to the local YMCA, York County, in Yorktown, Virginia, in the South. And every day in the locker room, all I would hear is the problems of this country are because we have a Muslim president who's a socialist. And finally, in 2016, I said, if only we had a Muslim president and he was a socialist. But that's literally what people felt throughout the period of Obama. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for your questions. Now we have 15 minutes for answering the questions. Each speaker have 5 minutes, please.
I'll try to make it short, and I'll try to best combine many of the questions and give one answer. Also, I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to do this. Well, at least I've tried to accomplish it. Well, I think many of the questions that have been raised are in a way connected to each other. And let me start here, because I did a case study, right? So I did not what my colleague was doing, linking this to an international structure. And I'm pretty much sure there is a lot of interest from outside. First of all, I mean, even if we speak, let's say, about the current Austrian Chancellor, right, Sebastian Kurz, he has no clue about anything, and especially not about Muslims and Islamic organizations, and don't even imagine Islamist organizations in far away. It's just not his field, he doesn't understand this, and I'm sure there is like people with a very specific interest that are defining this agenda. Maybe to tell one story, I mean, when he was visiting Assisi in Egypt, he was quoted in the newspaper saying he is a reformer of Islam and the future of Islam. So that tells us something about what kind of conversation they had and how they would also imagine different organizations and the roles they play. Lorenzo Vidino, whom I mentioned here, who is the author of the Muslim Brotherhood in Austria report, there is a leak by, I think, the Middle East Monitor that he met with Otaiba, the ambassador of the UAE to the United States. So obviously there must be some kind of links, right? So I think nobody can deny this. So there is an international dimension to all of this. Even if we recall some of the statements, let's say President Miloš Zeman from the Czech Republic, when he was quoted saying, the refugee crisis is an agenda planned by the Muslim Brotherhood because they are too weak to come with weapons, they come with people. And when he was asked, like, who told you this? He said 2 people. One is the foreign minister of Morocco, and the other is somebody from the foreign policy establishment in the UAE. So there is like an exchange of ideas that is happening here, and that is kind of creating this global discourse. And I think it's a pretty easy thing for them, even when we speak about the political discourse, the public discourse, because most of the people don't have a clue about Islam, forget about political Islam and what that means and what Muslim Brotherhood means. So the Muslim Brotherhood and Al-Qaeda is just one thing, right? So the legitimizing these kinds of policies, putting the Muslim Brotherhood as a non-terrorist organization together with other terrorist organizations that are designated as such, like IS, ISIS and Al-Qaeda, is an easy thing for them. Although it doesn't make sense at all, right? But what it does, it definitely expands the notion of extremism, right? And I would very much compare this to what is going on in China. Like in China, people are brought into these educational camps because they are reading the Quran on the graveyard, right? So it is a very simple Islamic practice that is becoming criminalized. And we have reached very similar levels of discourse in some European countries. To give you one example, the General Secretary of the ruling governing People's Party, he said, we have to think about, he didn't say we have to think about it, he said, we have to ban the fasting of Ramadan for pupils in school. Right? Obviously the argument was empowering Muslim pupils because they're not going to be weak, right? And they have to study. So it's all about empowerment, like it's about saving Muslim women and all of these discourses we know. But the basic idea is, I think, at the end of the day, that every idea that is Islamic is a criminal idea. So if you are already tackling the 5 pillars of Islam, that shows you how far they went, right? So in a way, I think the whole idea of expanding this notion of extremism and ideas, it started in 2014 with the act with ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Now with the 2019 act, it included the Muslim Brotherhood. In 2-3 years, it may include very simple Muslim practices. There was even one policy that they did not succeed in, but they closed 7 mosques because they said this is an attempt to fight political Islam. There was no ground, no reason for this. But at least, I mean, they did it. They were restricted again by a decision of the court, the Viennese Court of Administration, that said this was illegal, but still they tried it, right? And they were not attacking political Islam because the mosques they closed down were Sisi mosques, right? It was affiliated to Salafi, non-political, and pro-Egyptian regime mosques. But we see at least like how they play the game, right? One last word to the question, because I think that's an important one. What can we learn from the Swedish and Austrian case in comparison? Because I have no time just to go deeper into this issue. First of all, a reason why the author of the Muslim Brotherhood in Austria report was not questioned and his report was not questioned is because he was not in EU. He had no address in a European country, so he could not be sued. He is basically a resident of the United States, that's why he could not be sued, right? While in the case of the Swedish guy, he was based in Sweden, so you could adopt Swedish national law, and obviously because freedom of speech is much wider in the United States, you don't have no room, right, for any litigation. So this is one aspect. The other aspect is, I think, in a very clever way, they knew how to do it. The other thing is also because the Swedish report was published in March, the other one in October, and I think within these 6 months, they also learned a lot. Because one of the weaknesses of the Muslim Brotherhood in Sweden report was basically saying everybody's Muslim brother, while the second report was very cautious. And he was saying, like, there are different groups, and we have a typology, and there is a nearness to people who are near to the Muslim Brotherhood. But at the end of the day, what is left is like, somehow everybody's Muslim Brotherhood, but never directly saying it. So how can you challenge it, right? To give you one example, I was invited to a lecture, and then it was cancelled. And the reason for this was because it was financed by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is again a financer of this report. And the reason for this was they put the report there saying, well, it's because Farid Hafez is a Muslim brother. But then the other guy, who knew me very well, said, but Farid Hafez is not mentioned in this report. And he said, I don't care about this. He is meant in this report, right? You know, I mean, this is like the way how much they can expand this kind of state power in terms of making their decisions. So I don't want to take too much time also with my other colleagues, and maybe to stop here.
Thank you. Dr. Dalia?
Thank you. So let me do some misinterpretation cleanup. The 40% statistic is not a real statistic. There's a certain talk show pundit that comes on Fox News every night who was repeating the statistic as if it was true, because the more you repeat it, the more it becomes true. So all of those numbers were reflective of people that actually live in Democratic majority states. And yet for that statistic to be true, every single one of those people had to support terrorism. And so what I was trying to illustrate is how hysteria can be created by a false fact that has been picked up in the narrative that continues, right? So it's a fundamentally false fact. And so that's where I was going. The 76% comes from a Pew question that says, do you want religious law in mitigation of family disputes? It's a very benign question, but it's interpreted as 76% of Pakistanis support Sharia, and Sharia equals radicalism, right? So this is how you misinterpret the data, because you don't look at the question. And so this has been disputed, but it doesn't matter, right? You pick up the number anyway. And so what I was talking about was the creation of hysteria around false facts that have become taken as fundamentally true. The issue with Obama was, as he was leaving office, 46% of Americans still believed he was not American, right? And this was greater than it was when he was actually elected into office, right? But it was part of this beginnings of the Trump campaign, starting in 2010, we started fomenting this, well, we can't trust this person in office. How did we let it happen, right? So that's where I was going with that. The first question about what happened in Rabaa, right? I don't know where the young woman went. When we look at the language that was used at that moment, right, that there was إحنا شعب وهم مش شعب, right? That there are people, citizens, and they don't belong. They're not real citizens. This is the language of othering, right? That they are not just threats, but they are rodents, right? The language is these people are rodents. They need to be gotten rid of. This is the same language we saw in Rwanda, in the Congo, in Cambodia, and in Bosnia, right? That these are cockroaches. And what do you do with cockroaches, right? You have to destroy them. That's the only way to get rid of them. And so that language, when it's perpetuated through the media, as it was in all 5 of the other cases, the people pick it up and internalize it, right? In the United States, we're starting to see similar language happening to those on our southern border, that our president says that there's an infestation coming. And so as someone looks at genocide in other ways, the fear is that this leads to the elimination of the other. And that's why when I talk about it, it's not just white nationalism. White power is about the elimination of the other. And in the case of Egypt, it is the same genocide language we've heard in other places. And people believe it because it's told to them over and over again, right? This is just kind of patterns we see. Someone asked, why is Ilhan a threat, right? She sits on 2 very important committees. And she spoke very clearly against the death of Jamal Khashoggi, Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen, and she sits on appropriations. And so in order to eliminate her power, there was this attack on her from the UAE and Saudi Arabia. And the attack was, she needs to be removed from those committees. She needs to be removed from decision-making committees that fundamentally affect Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Right? So that's why she became a target, because she sits in a position of power on 2 important committees. Someone asked a question about the counter-narrative. There was a 600-page report issued by the Huffington Post of Muslims apologizing for things, Muslims condemning things, and why is there not a counter-narrative?
just because people aren't listening doesn't mean there isn't a counter-narrative, right? Just because it's being published doesn't mean there isn't a counter-narrative. When we look at the Muslim community in the United States, for example, Muslim community is the most economically stable religious minority community. The Muslim women are the second most highly educated religious minority grouping. Muslims are extremely productive. And the study conducted by one of my colleagues at the University of Seattle finds that the more mosque-going you are, the more civic-minded you become. The more mosque-going you are, the more you actually care about your country. You know what's happening, and so you participate. And then another study done by Amani Jamal at Princeton finds that the more you understand the Quran, not read, but understand the Quran, the more pro-justice for all you become. And so just because people aren't listening doesn't mean it's not happening. You know, ISPU just released a study on coverage of Muslim violence versus non-Muslim violence. Well, we know that 78% of all acts of violence in the United States today are committed by right-wing militias. But coverage of Muslim violence is 677% more than of non-Muslim violence. And so the perception leads to the creation of, well, there isn't an alternative. Just because people aren't listening and reporting on it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And finally, this conversation on Sheikh bin Bay'a and also on Sheikh Yaqubi, who's not mentioned here, is really interesting because in 2014, there was a session at the United Nations that I attended that was during the General Assembly period, but I don't know if you remember this because we had an exchange on Facebook about it. The United States hosted a counterterrorism summit during the G8 period. And one of the primary speakers was Sheikh bin Bay'a. And Sheikh bin Bay'a spoke about the problem of Islamic violence in the world is a Muslim problem. It's an Islamic problem. And so international community, you have nothing to do with it. We have to clean up our own house. And so he turned something into an internal, inward, we need to fix our religion. We kind of need this new rethinking of Islam in the world, which is extremely problematic. So that happened on Tuesday. On Wednesday, Sheikh Yaqubi this is in New York, he's at City Hall discussing the new book that he had just released, The Fatwa Against ISIS. And this is when CBE was taking ground, and New York City was possibly going to be one of the first cities to go through, to be the pilot city, right? It ended up being the city in California. And at the time, he was saying, again, in order for you to combat extremism in New York City, you need to go into the mosques, you need to understand what's happening in the religious community. Again, it was as if on the international and domestic level in New York City within the same week, you had this narrative coming from within the religious establishment saying, beware of the religious establishment, beware of mosques in your country. And so the interconnectedness of the Islamophobic rhetoric and network doesn't just have domestic implications, it has fundamental foreign policy implications. And at the international level, there is extreme funding over the marginalizations of Islam and Muslims in the West.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Please, Dr. Al-Azmi.
All right, so, I was just reminded, just to quickly sort of address the theme that was being addressed already. There's this great Vox video called This Is Your Brain on Terrorism. I recommend everyone watch it. But he has this fascinating statistic. Between the year 2001 and 2014, in the United States, there were 3,412 deaths because of terrorism. Roughly 3,000 of them on 9/11, and about 400 since then. Firearms caused 440,000 deaths in the same period. I mean, it's just completely off the chart. What we decide to focus on and think, why aren't people condemning this and condemning that, is often a function of broader discourse. I've written, I don't know how many articles, critiquing terroristic thinking. But unfortunately, the roots of that terrorism usually come from global geopolitics. So no matter how much Muslims condemn and condemn, they're constantly, if you rain down sort of terror on people constantly, people kind of crack and behave badly. And I think ultimately terrorism will be dealt with, as Salman Sayyid has put wonderfully in his book, Recalling the Caliphate, when the Muslims actually regain a great power. This is actually, it's not a controversial position. This is the position of The Economist as well. They have a great article called 100-Year-Old Mistake, where they ask themselves, were we wrong to basically destroy the caliphate? Because if you have a central power authority, you don't need to resort to terrorism. You engage on an international scale as powers. And so that's something to just think about. A lot of questions have been asked, and let me try and address whatever I can. I mean, how do we deal with sectarianism, calling people Khawarij and so on? Lady here asked. I think a lot of this comes back to education. If you look at the early period of Islam, you had a lot of divisive disagreements among scholars and different groups, but the overall majority learned to live with each other. And a lot of this comes back to just learning how the tradition works. Otherization is often a tool that is deliberately used to marginalize people so that you can kill them, so you can do these sorts of things. But we need to subvert that using the Islamic tradition very often. The resources are, unending within the Islamic tradition. Just as, groups can try and draw with difficulty resources to try and vilify each other from the Islamic tradition. If we had a healthy Islamic scholarly tradition today, then these sorts of things would kind of disappear, in my view. A very interesting question about Turkey, Qatar. You mentioned Iran, but my brother, who's a sort of HR consultant, says TQM, which is sort of management speak for total quality management. But he says Turkey, Qatar, and Malaysia. And I think the only way that these sorts of the axis of evil here, in my view, is the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and their wheel, so to speak, their tails. But they need to be counteracted on that sort of scale, on the geopolitical space, on the media space. I mean, someone was asking about how do we counteract these sorts of narratives of Al-Azmi and all the rest of them. In the last few weeks, I've been seeing still the Arab News published Preachers of Hate series, which included Yusuf Qaradawi. You say a lie enough times and people will believe you. There has to be a large-scale counter-narrative, which is not going to come from individuals working here and there. It's going to come from collectives who are, networked and very often, unfortunately, need financial backing as well. And that means sometimes you have to engage with state-level bureaucracies who are going to support that. And it could mean balancing out different kinds of considerations, because states are concentrations of power which necessitate certain kinds of moral evils. But I personally think the way this sort of thing will be countered, and people sitting in a room like this are the people who should be thinking, what can I contribute in terms of developing institutions and networks that will very self-consciously try and counteract these sorts of activities. Turkey is one of those states where we have the space at the moment to do that sort of engagement. But I think there are certain challenges. Turkey is a democracy, but there's not a democracy, okay? But they still promote freedom of speech, and this is things that the foreign minister will say. The discourse of the foreign minister of Qatar and the foreign minister of the UAE is really interesting to compare, political classes generally, because the Qataris will explicitly state, we want freedom of speech, and they'll say, we think freedom of speech is a dangerous thing. They'll say it explicitly. We talk about responsibility in speech. So those are the sorts of, the other side, I think, needs to congregate more. They should see this as an existential concern as well. It's not just for the autocracies. If the autocracies win here, democracy is finished, ultimately. So it is an existential concern, but obviously democracies have other dynamics internally which, mean that your horizon of thinking sometimes is a bit short term. I am being conscious of time. Should we use CVE terms against white supremacists? I mean, terrorism is a racialized term. It's very difficult at this stage of the discourse to use it against white supremacy. And so we need to subvert certain types of categories, and that's an ongoing conversation. But just to the example of suicide bombings, I noted down, has anyone watched the film Oblivion? Has anyone watched the film Independence Day? I mean, these things encapsulate moments of suicide bombings, which are valorized in Western public discourse. That's seen as heroic in something like Saving Private Ryan, but even the vilification of that in certain contexts is part of a discourse of Islamophobia. So, I'm not making an apology for suicide bombing. I was really interested in your comment about human rights as a Western concept complicating our discourse of Islamophobia. I think that's a very, very sort of subtle concern that is going to have to be confronted at some point. I'm an Islamic theologian as well, and when I think about global human rights discourse, what I'm asking is, if I buy into global human rights discourse through the sort of liberal lens, there are all sorts of things that come into that system which I don't feel comfortable with, because they don't, I have certain epistemic foundations which do not align with the liberal tradition. And I want to develop an alternative paradigm that is also a human rights discourse. But that's something that Muslims, I think, and Islamic theology needs to reflect on. But when we're sort of fighting against an oncoming army of Islamophobes, it's not something that you have the luxury to do as much. And so we're going to have to confront that at some point. And let's see what we can do. I think institutionalization, setting up institutions. I was speaking to some friends in London who've worked in the think tank industry, and the fourth generation of think tanks are basically advocacy groups as small as 3 people. You just need 3 people, enough funding to keep 3 young people, on social media and lobbying actively enough. You don't need a great deal of thought. Anyway, so.
Thank you for your.
Thank you very much.
Dear distinguished scholars and guests, finally we come to the end of the session. I would like to present the speakers their awards. Please.
Thank you very much for a powerful and very excellent session. We're on streak here. It's really a very good session. Thank you very much for all of you. I'd like just to give you some words. We'll start with Dr. Farid Hafez. Very well, we're supposed to start our next session at 11:45, so we're going to extend it a bit. Please try to be here at 11:55 so that we can start. And the next session will be Islamophobia in the Service of Empire. I guarantee it will be a very interesting session, inshallah. Thank you very much.